Hi, Eleni. Welcome to Drag and Drop.
Hi, Feroz, thank you very much for inviting me.
It's a pleasure to have you. It'd be good to, start with a bit of an introduction to yourself about your background and kind of, who you are.
So I've been in IT all of my career. I started as a developer many years ago and worked in pretty much most of the positions. I've worked as a architect. I worked as a project manager in strategy in private and public sector, and I've had CIO and CDTO roles in both sides before. So my sweet spot, if you like, is digital transformation, especially when it's chaotic. The more chaotic, the better.
The better.
And of course, M&A and then post day one integrations.
Interesting. And, in regards to, you've spent nearly kind of 3 decades, operating at the intersection of technology and P&L, right? So when you walk into an organization today, what non-technical markers tell you that technology is quietly, destroying value rather than creating it?
So it's usually quite common. A lot of it's across industries, to be fair. So one of the first things I look at is how mature are we around processes. So what is the normal approval? What is the workflows? Is there any shadow workflows in the background? How are we doing data reconciliation? And spending time talking to people across the organization. And that's when you start finding actually we're using Excel for everything. We're doing our data reconciliation is not quite there. We have workarounds. This lets me understand where the hidden costs are, especially around productivity. The second thing I looked about always is culture. I need to understand the culture. And what I mean by that, do we have a blame the IT culture,
Uh-huh.
right? So what happens when there's a problem, when there's a hiccup or there's a missed deadline? How does the organization react to that? And not necessarily just the board, but how do the day-to-day users? Because that gives me an idea about how they view IT and what I need to be aware of and understand. Because again, that blame culture always leads to low morale.
Mhm.
And the third thing I look at is my first team meetings. What is the tech leaders talk about? Are they discussing BAU or are they talking about strategy? Because if they're spending the time talking about patching and maintenance and outages and so on, this is taking time of their day. They won't have the time or the capacity to think about trends, to think about how do we use AI, how do we enable the business. And of course, there's no innovation.
Yeah, that's interesting. And when you're going and talking to these teams, and with your style of leadership, is there sometimes some resistance, or they're a bit surprised by that approach?
Yes, because I think usually people want to say, okay, this is what we do.
Yeah,
But I think I can get to the details of what you do. I want to understand how do you feel about what you're doing? What is the impact? What what do you spend your time thinking about? And I do that even outside of IT, because that's when I get to the real uh, cracks of the problem. And
uh,
sometimes having these quick conversations gives you a lot more information than sitting through countless PowerPoints or looking
yeah,
at reports. You need to be very
yeah,
close to the people who feel the impact of technology.
yeah, definitely. And you've spoken about margin erosion, being driven by accumulated complexity rather than the tools themselves. Where does that complexity usually originate? Is it architecture, governance, or organizational design?
See, I think architecture does have a factor, but I often find architecture reflects the organization design. So I've worked in a lot of organizations where they're multinationals, and but they're very federated. So each business entity is rewarded and they're having their own P&L, which means that they're building their own empire. We have redundant systems. They're not really rewarded for having a seamless cross-functional organization and solution. I've been of an organization, in a particular one, that had 3 versions of Salesforce.
Wow.
And that has come from that siloed mentality. And obviously with that, there's no centralized governance model for technology investments because everyone is responsible for their own P&L. So decisions become decentralized. And then there is no thinking about complexity and what it means. And that in itself creates a legacy mindset. I'm not talking about the technology here.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the way, the structure around the technology, the way of working, the processes, the decision making. And that is often what causes fear around transformation and fear of consolidation and looking around the best and optimized solution.
And you've also spoken about, digital transformation failures are really about the technology, right? And, but about the decision latency, so from a CIO's perspective, what does decision latency actually look like inside large enterprises?
Yes, it's not, when you're looking at decision latency, it's not, I don't mean that an executive is slow signing
Mm,
something off, but I was given this example a while ago about an organization. It was like trying to turn an oil tanker. And it's
mm,
just that sheer force of trying to get a decision moving across the different layers, understanding the conflicting priorities, and that fear of not wanting to be blamed.
mm,
So one of the first things I do when I sit with the board is really understanding, okay, what is your risk of appetite? Because we don't always, if you spend time doing what if analysis and gathering more data and refining the models and forecasting, you don't actually get on and do it. So tell me what your appetite for risk is, and then I will then build in the cost of doing nothing. Because that's also is quite an eye opener. All the moment that you are spending mulling over a decision or not making a decision, your competitors have done it, got a prototype,
mm.
and they're getting feedback.
Yeah.
Sometimes when you position it like that, it opens the minds a little bit. The other thing I see quite a lot is that there is not a guardrail for decisions. And what I mean by that is teams should be empowered to make their own decisions, even from the Scrum team. They should be very clear what they're responsible for, what are the decisions, and what do they need to escalate. And again, the escalation needs to be very, very clear. So it's okay to get it wrong, by the way. I know I was saying that it's, 80% of the decisions we will take, they will probably be wrong in the wrong time.
Mm.
But we need to have the right environment there where you're very clear, I'm making this decision and that's fine. And the next decision I need to escalate it because they're very clear markers around it. So it's not about this whole decision latency. It's not about not having enough information,
Mm.
but it's that inability and the lack of culture to empower people to act decisively on the information that you have. And then when you do have roadblocks, are you empowered or do you know how to remove them?
Having worked in, multiple organizations, do you see this as a common thread that happens, or is it more kind of, like when you go in, is this more than often happening?
It's quite often, actually. It's very few organizations. I saw that. And I think if um, I can name it, when I used to work for J Capital,
Mm.
they thrived on quick decision making. And very often we would get a product from origination to the market in 3 months. And
Wow.
the reason that was, it's
Mm.
because of, and that was back 2008, I started with them. It's because
Mm.
they have very clear guardrails. It wasn't about, I need to make the CIO had to make every single decision, but it was very clear
Mm.
what decisions I could make as the project manager, what decisions I need to escalate. And I also know if I keep within the spirit of what was expected of me, and I think they had something, code of conduct called the
Yeah.
spirit. So if you keep and you act within the spirit, then all is good. But that's the only way they could get a product that quickly. It was
Mm,
unheard of. No other financial services was doing anything like that.
mm. Yeah, yeah. And many organizations are still, running fragmented technology estates, right? So multiple CRM instances, duplicated platforms, disconnected data. What does it realistically take to unwind that level of complexity while you're still trying to protect the business?
That is very common. There's not a perfect organization I can think of, or in my experience anyway.
Mm,
And there's also not a silver bullet or a perfect roadmap. So what I found works is you need to have, as a CIO or a technology leader, you need to have a strong mandate, and the board must trust you and give you the accountability on that. So you need that support from the CEO. But you, as a CIO or as a technology leader, you need to make sure the board understands that legacy modernization is not an IT initiative. I know we often say it is an IT, but it's not. So we need to make sure the board understands that there is a strategic value,
mm,
and we have very clear business outcomes. So we can tie it back to the strategy, or we can tie it back to strong KPIs like revenue growth, for example. It will give us less outages. That means our clients are happy, we retain the clients, and so on. The other thing that, again, is not very popular is you have to fix the basics. And again, most organizations that I've worked with, and I know from my peers, it's data governance is not, and data quality is never at the forefront, especially when you're trying to implement AI. You need to get the basics. You need to have clear data ownership. You have to have the quality. You need to have integration strategy before you do anything. But often, as technologist leaders, we're not very good in translate that into business outcomes, which means they're getting deprioritized. And I think the third thing I would say for this, in quotes, perfect roadmap on the modernization is need to agree as a board which capabilities are critical to the business. And I don't mean a system or a particular platform, I mean capabilities. So I don't know if you ever come across it. There's a framework called VRIO. I think that's
yeah,
value, rarity.
yeah.
Yeah, right. So I usually use that because what that tells me is outside of my pet platform or pet
Yeah.
system that I like to sponsor, is what is vital for the business. Okay, what gives the value? What is rare? What is difficult to imitate, and so on?
Mm,
And do I have the resources to deliver the value? And
mhm,
then you can get everybody agreed on data, on what drives the roadmap and what drives the priorities, so that you don't have this constant fight
mhm,
of which initiative to prioritize. So again, this is not a silver bullet, but I
mm,
found through pain, these three are the basics.
yeah, yeah. And when a large transformation program stalls, so it's often framed as a delivery or program management problem, but in your experience, how much of that is actually misalignment between
Yeah.
technology decisions and P&L accountability?
It's easy to blame the project or the program manager, I think,
Mm,
for where transformation doesn't go to plan. But it's usually there's a little bit more to it than that. When you have got um, when you're not transparent about the true cost. So, for example, you try to implement a new tool, and the board only understands the licensing cost, for example, when there's a
mhm,
SaaS platform, or
yeah,
the project costs, and they give the okay. They always get a surprise when they realize actually there is a lot more cost because there's maybe the data is not quite right to
yeah,
integrate, or there's a lot of legacy and we need to build the integration behind it. Requires a lot of time from the in-house team. They don't see the end-to-end. And that always causes uncomfortable discussions down the end. You're not, you also do not have evaluate technology investments the right way. What I mean by that is, again, it's having the newest thing, like take AI, for example, let's
Yeah.
implement AI. But how do you evaluate that? And what problem are we trying to solve? And who's responsible for it? What is the benefit? Who's going to be responsible for the benefit and reporting on that? Who's accountable? So once you start aligning that and ask those questions, and you should be asking that in the beginning, it takes a lot of the myth about why transformations fail away. It's what I keep saying, is going back to basics.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it's speaking about obviously AI, that's kind of probably the last 2 years, every conversation is around AI, especially probably for you, right? Many organizations, they want to say they want AI transformation, but most are still struggling to modernize their architecture. So, are companies trying to run AI on foundations that were never designed for it?
Do you know, I was discussing this in a workshop, I think, the other day. And
Yeah.
again, yes, we're 2 years down the line and everybody wants to talk about AI. Everybody's talking
Mm.
about AI. What do you mean by AI? I think that's probably
Yeah.
my first questions.
Yeah.
But I think what it's very clear is you've got to fix your data. You've got fragmented data. Large language models, they just thrive on connected data sets. If you have your data scattered all over your legacy systems, you really have to invest in what I call data archaeology, right? So, what is a customer, for example? Is a customer the same across all your systems, or do you call it something else? You need to get that fixed. And then the other thing that is not very clear, again, to non-technology leaders, it's training and deploying
Yeah.
AI models, especially Gen AI. It requires huge computational power. And that is never, when we all went to the cloud, I don't know that
Mm.
we had foreseen that. And that is additional investment. It goes back from my previous point
Yeah.
about the true end-to-end costs. When you have legacy tech, it can't handle that. So what you end up is you deploying a POC. It usually doesn't run very well. It's got
Yeah.
huge demand. Something else dies. You need to upgrade or scale. That is additional costs. And then your pilot stall. And then that's why there was a recent research that came out of one of the big financial companies that most 80% of AI projects fail.
Fail.
And
Yeah.
they fail because of this reason. You don't have the end-to-end view. That is not just about buying that model and building it. It's about your infrastructure. And then obviously you have to monitor it.
Mm.
You have to make sure there's no drift and they make their own decisions and it's not fair. And you've got to have your security and governance policies. The security risk now, it's compound, right,
Yeah.
with AI, and more importantly, the ethics around it. Because ultimately, as a CIO, I would still be responsible for the decisions the AI makes,
Yeah.
right? You can't
Yeah.
hide behind of that. So it's prerequisite to have the foundations in place. And we need to be able, as technology leaders, to ensure the board understands that. And they're very clear that it's not just buying that tool, it's about fixing some of your basics to get the value out of it.
Yeah, interesting. And how I know you is obviously through the art systems side of things, and platforms like art systems, they've been positioned as accelerators for modernization, right? So, from your experience as a customer, where do you see these platforms generally changing the delivery equation, and where do
Mm.
organizations still get it wrong?
I mean, the time to market is the key point, right? So you've
Mm.
got traditional development. It will take 12, 18 months to get a new platform or new product online. And with a low code platform, you do it in a few sprints. that is phenomenal. The value to the business is phenomenal. And because you can get it so quickly, the wider team can understand what you're building. So you're not building something in a dark corner. They can see a prototype very quickly and being able to give feedback and allow the developers to iterate. So, I mean, that is incredibly valuable to that. So it improves, I think, the relationship between IT and other functions of the business. But what it also does, and I see there's some organizations that do it really, really well, is it's this talent gap, right? Especially with local developers.
Yeah.
It's so quickly now. It's the last few years that you can't find the right talent. But what you can do is you can open it up to citizen developers. So instead of using your own development team to get an idea and bring it to a POC, you can use your wider organization with less training time than you would in
Mhm.
traditional development. But I have the but here. It's great for bringing an idea to fruition and then people can see it and feel it and so on. It doesn't mean that some of the traditional development concepts go out of the way. So there's still, and I think this is where, to your point about organizations getting it wrong,
Yeah.
it's you still need to think about architecture. Okay, that does not go out of the window. You need to think about your integrations. You need to go back to your data, understand how it all connects together. What is the governance? And I think our systems does this particularly well because it's a part of their ways of working. They're very
Yeah.
hot on governance and decision making. And they're very fast the way that they expect the decisions while you are in a sprint. If you don't have that, if your organization is not ready for that fast way of working, it's not going to work very well. So it's not again a one size fits all. You need to
Mhm.
understand that when you are going for a low code or no code, you're not going away with all the other traditional um,
Yeah.
components, architecture and governance and so on, and decision making, right? So who's making the decision? How fast you want the decisions?
I'm interested to know, obviously, because you started as a developer, right? And a lot of people I speak to have that developer background. I'm interested to know when you were made aware of low code and what was your initial kind of, were you skeptical? Were you more, obviously as a leader, you have to be more open to these things, but what was your personal standpoint on low code?
I'm embarrassed to say I was very skeptical to begin with,
Okay.
probably because I was a traditional developer, and I
Oh,
thought, I don't know if e- everyone can remember that, but Visual Basic, I thought, oh, this is just
yeah.
like another Visual
Yeah.
Basic tool, and it's not. And when I saw the applications they built, the quality, the user experience, I was really, really impressed. And I changed my mind very quickly because I think you
Mhm.
can't change your mind. I think you should be
Yeah.
ready to change your mind. Now I'm a fan. I think that there are areas where they can make a huge difference. There's some areas that probably low code is not suited, when you
Yeah.
have very heavy algorithmic customizations
Mhm.
in the background. But when you want to do fast product development, or you need to remove bottlenecks in an M&A and you need to make integrations and build something quickly, I just think, why would you do it a different way? It makes no sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And you've spoken about, building resilient delivery engines rather than just IT teams, right? So, what differentiates organizations that can consistently deliver technology change from those that are constantly, firefighting?
I think the problem with firefighting is you have no time to sit back and understand why you're firefighting because you're trying to fix the hole. And then the next fire comes and you have to fix that. You can't concentrate on the end-to-end flow. So you can never get out of the firefighter mode. And sometimes I think I have been in organizations where I force the team to just stop, because they usually know if they're given time to see um, time to think, they will come up with the answer themselves. But you need to be able to put a stop and say, we are not focusing on tasks, we are focusing on end-to-end value. Are we delivering value for the business? But also, I think it goes very well, resilience goes with culture. So you need to have empowered teams, and everybody in the team needs to understand what they are responsible for and where they need help and what can they be empowered to do it. If you start coming from every decision to your manager, that's not empowerment. And then you can't do anything else because all that manager is doing is just approving decisions.
Yeah.
And what's your handshakes as well? It's just, it all goes back around that culture piece. But also more importantly is how close is this technology team to the rest of their business? Because in resilient teams, technology teams, IT is the business. So they understand the strategy, they understand where we're going, not just a little piece of their execution that they're responsible for. So they can build what the organization needs, not what it wants, because they can anticipate, they understand the problem, the challenge, they can anticipate a future crisis or a future demand. So it just goes down to being one team, empowered team. And I would say that culture is actually more important in this than anything else.
Yeah, definitely. And as AI becomes more embedded into enterprise systems, technology is moving from executing instructions to enabling autonomous decisions. So how does that shift change the way CIOs like yourself need to think about enterprise architecture?
You need to start thinking a lot more around auditability, right? And the architecture needs to support that transparency. Why was the decision made? And we need to be able to be very clear. Why did you make that decision? And explain that and log it and audit. Just because you have an agent making a decision, it doesn't mean accountability as a CIO or technology leader it goes away. So you need to have the architecture has got agents and humans, right? And they need to be able to reason and plan and act and so on. So you need to have interoperability between all of them. So these are the sort of things to think about it. And sorry, I keep going on about data.
Yeah.
Right? You need to have access to the data and the real time processing. Okay, so if you don't fix your data, this is where it's going to fall over. And then we've all heard about the human in the loop. But I don't know how much time people spend on that. Because if you build a workflow and the human only checks at the very end, is that the best way?
Yeah.
Where do you build your autonomy and where do you have the clear oversight? And I don't know that there is very clear guardrails at the point, or this is a one size fits all. But these are the things we need to start thinking and questioning ourselves when we are designing anything to do around AI. So
Yeah.
AI is not just another tool, I think, at this point. We need to design and architect with that in mind. It just cannot come as an afterthought.
Yeah. And with organizations, a lot of organizations are looking to introduce AI agents, right? And agentic AI is the new flavor that everyone's talking about. And you touched on guardrails. What guardrails really do you feel need to exist before these systems can safely, make those decisions inside an enterprise?
I think you have to go, I always like it, always chunk it down, have to have a very defined scope and the boundaries, right? So start small and start with your high volume, low value tasks and increase autonomy. I mean, if I give an example in financial services, start with your invoicing first, right? Do that. Get an agent to do that before you move into fraud prevention. Because you need to also learn, you need to get the feedback of how things work as the human. Be very clear that every autonomous decision needs a human in the loop. Goes back again to the accountability. That's why you need the monitoring and the alerting to be able to understand what happened when. Can I review it and override it as well? And it goes back to your and also interpretation. Okay, so because the other thing we need to think about is as we're deploying AI, we have got a human team that needs to build trust. Otherwise, the adoption will fail, POCs will stall, and so on. So
Yeah.
we need to be able at each point to understand what happened, why it happened, and could we do anything different? It's not it's not really rocket science, but it is there's some fundamentals that we need to think about. And just like every tool, you need to think about your data privacy and security. This is not about I've got a policy that will cover it and just I'll think about AI as an afterthought.
Oh,
You need to rethink about your whole data privacy around the agents as well. So they're just like another employee. And that goes obviously you have to have the policies around it
yeah.
to be able to monitor them as well. We can't just treat it as just a tool now.
Mm. And as autonomy is increasing, in these AI systems, questions around identity and accountability become more complex, right? So if an autonomous system makes a decision that impacts the business, in your view, who ultimately owns that decision?
Do you think this is getting discussed, I think, more and more often?
Oh.
And it's you get different interpretations. I think people think, okay, if the AI made the decision, I'm in the clear. No, ultimately, I think if you are the business owner, you're responsible for the decision. So you need to understand, go back to transparency, why the AI made that decision and at which point were you alerted and so on. Or ultimately the CIO or the board, depends on what it is, right? It goes back to the guardrails that you've
Yeah.
been in. But then when you go to that the human has to be the decision maker. Which human are we talking about? Are we talking about the board? Are we talking about the person who trained the AI? Are we talking about the person who operates it? You need to be very clear and define that early on, and keep refining it as well. It's not, it's quite complex, I think, and I don't know that we've nailed it yet.
Yeah. And there's this debate around, obviously, AI native platforms, and versus development platforms embedding AI capabilities such as our systems. What's your view on that? And how do you see this playing out, from an enterprise architecture perspective over the next few years?
I think I hear people talking about AI and sort of local development as
Mm,
an existential threat. Um, but I think it's just another transformation, if you like. As a developer, and I would say that to any developer, you need to understand how you can work with AI and low code, right? And what is your role now? So I think the future of writing every line of code is gone. I think in the
yeah,
next few years we will see that changing quite a bit. But the value as a human developer is really around integration, understanding the architecture, orchestration. That, and obviously the sort of domain, right? The
yeah.
business domain expertise. So that's not going to go away and it cannot be replicated. So the role changes. It's not that we won't have developers, but their role will change quite significantly.
Do you have what's your view on vibe coding? Vibe coding is obviously creating a big wave, right? Obviously, that's taking citizen development to a new level, right? Where anyone can get involved. What's your stance on it?
I think my stance is the same with low code and citizen developers. It's
Mm,
great if you want to get something out there quickly and there is no low risk. The problems comes when you need to scale it or when things go wrong. Because can you understand where it has gone wrong? And can you understand the code behind it? This is where you have to go back into traditional knowledge and the concepts. I mean, I've learned when I was even back in university, I've learned about object-oriented programming. That
Mm,
hasn't changed. Now we
yeah.
can call it different things,
Yeah.
but the basics of that has not changed, right? So if you don't understand that, you might not understand when you're looking at something. Oh, why did it write like that? Well, what does that mean? And why is it not particularly efficient? And how can I make a difference? You can't even instruct the agent to write better code because you don't understand where the root cause of the problem is. So I'm all for it, for getting things quickly and having
Mhm.
quick POCs and getting ideas out
Yeah.
on paper. But I think if you are trying to industrialize something, scale it, or find things that you haven't even considered, then you do need to go fall back on traditional methods.
Yeah. Yeah. And you touched on it, with developers thinking about, obviously, with AI in their careers, from your perspective, what capabilities should they really be focusing on, going forward, to ensure that, there's this thing about, obviously, with AI coming into the mix, if you don't follow it, you'll be left behind, right? So what's your advice on that?
Um, I think things to think about is understanding prompt engineering, right? How do you communicate with LLMs? Because that's really what we're talking about.
Uh,
And then how can you start debugging that? Okay, and how do you direct this? So you need to understand. That's why I'm going back to traditional methods. Is you need to understand a lot
uh,
to be able to debug it and direct it. And then what what's the impact of your data? Do you understand your data well enough to understand the impact it's going to have in with AI,
uh,
right? And sort of the orchestration. How do you improve it and make it better? And going back to security, I mean, we've had it for years now, secure by design. That needs to
uh,
change. That needs to even be more augmented, right? When you do with AI. So I think actually the developer is not going to be just a guy that just or a girl that writes code.
uh,
It's going to be a much more multifaceted role, and I think it's a very exciting time for developers and how they evolve. I think it's the greatest thing you could do is be curious.
yeah, definitely. And you've worked in environments involving M&A and large organizational change. How do you think AI will reshape integration strategies when companies merge these systems and platforms and their environments?
There's some things I think AI will be amazing. For example, doing that, the data mapping, right? And sort of data archaeology on emerging companies, understanding where, um, what are the common entities, what rules can you have. I think you could do a lot of speed up a lot on this, and especially around reconciliation. We've seen that in some organizations already. That's going to be, incomparable to doing it all manually. There is a lot of opportunity to automate a lot of the due diligence, right? Because some of the especially when you have technology integrations, the due diligence, you could learn a lot from it. So you don't have to start everything from scratch. So that will help identify risks. It will help you identify even start building and feeding into project plans. Now, what it cannot do is critical thinking. When you have a good M&A integration manager to say, you know what, this doesn't feel right, or I need to think of a different way of doing this. The AI will not do that. So again,
Mm,
AI will have to think of them as a very fast employee and be very clear on the tasks we give it. Okay,
yeah,
but it's not going to replace you. You're not going to start seeing automated AI integration managers.
yeah. And looking ahead, fast forward 3 to 5 years, in your view, what do you think will define a great CIO in the age of AI? And what capabilities do you think will become non-negotiable?
This is a really good question because I think the role of CIO is in danger at the moment because of AI. It's a danger and it's an opportunity. The challenge we have is if you talk to most people, they think they understand AI. They use
Mm,
ChatGPT or Claude or
yeah,
Gemini, and they get it. They could just deploy. They think they know how to deploy. Or we'll just ask ChatGPT how to
yeah,
do X, Y, Z. So as CIOs, we need to be very clear on what problem we're trying to solve and why, and what is the business outcome. Okay, and being able to translate that value to the board. But we also need to understand that this is, like I said before, this is like bringing another employee here. So we need to have the ethics around it and the policies and what does responsible deployment looks like. And data stewardship becomes even more important, right? Because ultimately the CIO would own, and still it does own even today, the data
yeah,
strategy, which becomes, it's one of the fundamentals, right, to deploy your AI. So this is where you add value. But as a CIO, you need to be able to demonstrate the value from AI and the business outcomes you're going to do. I think if you don't do that, so it means you need to be very commercially minded,
mm,
you're in danger of losing your seat on the board.
interesting. And finally, as we're in the low code space, and as someone who's been involved in projects in that space, I'd be interested to know, for people who are considering these platforms now and looking at evaluating these platforms, over what you've learned going through these process, what's some advice you would give them that maybe when you started, you didn't know, but obviously now you're well aware of to help them succeed?
I think it's your organization will never going to be fast enough to catch up with that. Because once you start running, it's a run. So you need to have everything set up around them to enable to get the best out of the local development. So you need to understand what decisions you can make, what decisions you can get wrong, and it's fine. And what flexibility do you have? But that also means that your organization needs to be behind it. This is not about IT, right? It's about your whole business being behind it and understanding the role they have to play. So I think that is fundamental. Otherwise, you can't get the value out of it.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to speak to me. It was really great to kind of hear, your journey, your views on, how things are evolving and what the future may look like, and I think, it'd be great as things kind of change and move. I think we could have a whole nother conversation in the future of so many different topics. I'd love to get you on
Mm.
again in the future, but I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to me.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you. You've been a great host, and thank you again for inviting me. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Appreciate it. Thank you.